الآن سوف ننتقل إلى الدكتورة إيرينا. دكتور إيرينا, how are you?
Good, thank you.
You will talking about right now the internet in Iran. Okay, the floor of yours. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly honored to be here today. Thank you to Maat for this opportunity. So I'll start by discussing the myth, the idea that the Iran regime will fall soon. Imagine you're a young man or woman living in a totalitarian theocratic state where the government is more concerned about exporting its dogma abroad than for providing for basic needs or even lives of its own citizens. Imagine a future with no hope, but either poverty, drug use, or tortured imprisonment in the event you speak up. Imagine that no help is coming. You know that millions of people depend on this regime for basic sustenance and actively contribute to the bureaucratic apparatus that keeps it alive, even as they know that their actions also contribute to their own misery and that of 80 million other people. Imagine that the population is divided, paranoid, infiltrated, and turned on each other. No matter how bad it gets, the possibility of real freedom, having to figure out a way to govern, live together, and accept all the things that up until now you have been taught to find unacceptable, seems at least as bad as the bleak reality of living in fear, gloom, and misery day after day with no change in sight. Imagine these stark, painful contradictions, and you'll find yourself in the Islamic Republic of Iran today, over 40 years after the Islamic Revolution brought the regime to power. Every year, dissidents gather abroad wishing for the fall of the regime and predicting its imminent demise. Every year, they pronounce that Iran is on the brink, that one or a few more protests and the regime will break down either today or 5 years from now. But without a clear picture of how that would come about, what the transition would look like, and how to move forward to a better future, this future may never arrive. This framework is important to understand and to see how and why the regime is using internet blackouts before periods of human rights abuse. They do so not because they're afraid of free speech, not because they think that these protests, if allowed to go on long enough, will have any chance of success. At the end of the day, Iranian army and other security apparatus have the tanks and the power, and without their assistance, no riots will ultimately, physically or logistically reach the point where a coup is possible everywhere at once. Not because they're weak and are afraid that the fair winds of Western liberalism and democracy will suddenly turn all 80 million against them and overwhelm even the IRGC. No, the reality is that the reign of terror is a well-oiled machine that requires psychological and physical management. They let the people vent their rage outside and then put a stop to it on their own terms. Iran, as it is, has full control of the situation. It is a police state, and every protest can be safely presumed to be infiltrated either by the intelligence forces or by active informants from the very start. All these protests are doomed to failure, but to maintain a tight hand over the situation, Iran has to show that it is in full control at all times. Internet blackouts are part of the psychological breakdown and message of hopelessness, that all resistance is futile, that the Iranian people should not even dream of change because nothing in their lives at all is in their control. How and why does this work? There are several contributing factors that help Iran sustain its supremacy over its very diverse, educated population, but the myths that feed into illusions and prevent effective response and strategies must be dismantled. Myth number one: Iran was a thriving modern country before the revolution. After the regime falls, the country can return to some form of normalcy, whether as a monarchy or a republic. Far from being a beloved, enlightened despot, the Shah was known for his uneven tendency, paranoia, brutality, and was seen as a threat, particularly by the Arab world. At one point, he even contemplated the development of nuclear weapons. Many of the officers of Sabak, the fearsome internal security apparatus, seamlessly transitioned into the new Islamic Republic regimes because power for the sake of power was what they were used to. And despite not necessarily being ideologically Khomeinist, they could work just as well under one regime as under another. We have seen a similar process with the transition from the KGB to what has been Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. To understand the methods of Iranian intelligence today, we have to recall the Soviet Union, despite its differences with Iran at various points in history, trained the Iranian intelligence in all of its methods. So despite having Islamist leanings, it still follows the same playbook. This is important to know because Soviet Union operated in the era before the internet, as did the Iranian regime until the last couple of decades. But the protests were dispersed by the same means as they are today, and the existence of the internet did not bring Russia any closer to a true democracy or liberalism than the internet in Iran, with all the VPNs and all the liberal ideas. That is how we know that Iran is not, in fact, afraid of the internet or bad influence. It has the tried and true techniques that never change, techniques that rely as much on psychological manipulations as on physical control that will work the same way no matter the technological progress. That brings us to myth number 2. Most Iranians oppose the regime, don't support the Islamic Revolution, and want something different. Upon closer examination, that premise falls apart because if that were actually true, most of the bureaucracy upon which the Iranian regime relies for support on every level would have just put down their weapons, keyboards, or prison keys and walked away. The regime would have fallen with hardly a drop of blood being spilled. The problems with this scenario are as follows. Whereas security mechanisms, including a network of informants, is far wider and better connected than anyone is willing to acknowledge, and they do not wish to see a different system. Most informants are not known, otherwise protests would have succeeded. This results in paralyzing paranoia, which prevents any real strategy from emerging, and whatever ideas do circulate, they're quickly hijacked by agents provocateur. Iranians have a complex and at times contradictory ideology, which is often grandiose and unrealistic, even if we take the religious elements out of it altogether. It is based on various mythologies and an unhealthy ethnocentric and chauvinist worldview that also prevents effective long-term cooperation with outsiders. That ideology leads to all sorts of cultural biases against one another and against ethnic and religious minorities, which has stood in the way of cohesive, unifying nation-state or monarchical approach. Even under the Shah, oppression of minorities caused internal divisions that the Shah was able to manipulate to hold power until such time as political movements dissatisfied with his rule got the better of the situation. These divisions are real and cannot be wished away. Simply giving access to the internet will not change complicated identity issues ingrained from birth. As we have seen, people don't stop being racist, nor automatically start recognizing the basic rights of others just because they gain access to communicate with more enlightened societies. While the opposition abroad likes to claim that most of Iran is opposed to the regime, that may not be completely true. Many people may be disillusioned and others may hate living a miserable, poor life, but that doesn't mean that they wish to see instability or uncertainty or want to be involved in a revolution. They just want life to get better by any means. They're not impermeable to regime propaganda, and different grievances make it difficult to unite on any concrete demand or response. But the key points here are myth number 3. Most Iranians are liberal and most Iranians are atheist or not religious. There's simply no way to know just how many Iranians are truly liberal, democratic, or who has moved away from Khomeinism or from Islam altogether. The most vocal and critical voices in the West or among the occasional dissidents are not necessarily representative or reflective of the larger reality, and there's no surefire way of taking polls for obvious reasons. It is safer to presume that most Iranians are less religious than the Ayatollahs, but more religious than anyone would like to admit. Imagine generations of people increasingly indoctrinated in a dogmatic society and who have never traveled far outside Iran or long enough for it to make an impression. In this case, internet is not going to suddenly make them believe in a paradise abroad. The effect might be the opposite. Liberalism is what will make the regime fall, is another false perception. Liberalism did not make the Soviet Union fall. Successful military and political strategies did, coupled with internal corruption. Ultimately, that did not bring about a truly liberal and democratic country. There's no reason to believe anything different would be true of Iran unless there's a very thorough transition process with all enablers being put on trial or otherwise publicly delegitimized. But given that we don't know how many inside the country actually support a more liberal system, as opposed to, say, just less corruption and a better economic environment, it is hard to say whether that will succeed. Moreover, it's unclear how many understand that the Islamic revolution is a feature, not a bug, and that their problem is with the entire system, not just particular individuals or factions. Nor do Iranians necessarily dream of a more peaceful future. While they may be resentful of funding going abroad for dubious adventures, most will not tolerate dissent inside the country. We see it from the rampant social discrimination against Ahwazi Arabs and other minorities, and the opposition's silence against the ideological oppression of ethnic groups who wish for more autonomy or independence. Being a reactionary opposed to a particular regime does not make one a liberal. We have seen plenty of ex-Soviets who have not studied Enlightenment thinkers and at first opportunity have adopted an authoritarian streak so reminiscent of the system they grew to hate. All of that brings us to myth number 4. If only Khamenei is removed along with the other Ayatollahs in IRGC, Iran will instantly become a more prosperous and happy country because its people are educated, cultured, hardworking, and value professional success. But how did it come to pass that most of the skilled Iranian hackers are still lagging behind their Russian, Chinese, North Korean, or American counterparts, and are still mostly working for the regime? We know that because if most didn't, Iranian institutions would have already collapsed or been disabled much more so than possible by occasional foreign covert action with some domestic assistance. Most Iranians travel back and forth as opposed to fleeing the loathsome regime. They refuse to let go of the oil-rich province of Ahwaz, which is mostly Arab and which has been annexed in 1925, having enjoyed independent or semi-independent status up until that point, in part due to the access to natural resources. Many nations around the world have become prosperous without having to depend on natural resources. Even those who do depend heavily on them are now working to diversify their economies. But part of the reason with the regime's obsessive oppression of Ahwazis and the silence of the minority forest population is at least as much economic as ethnocentric and nationalist. They don't want to let go of the oil and gas and cannot envision a state without a full control over these resources. So maybe the assumptions about the inclinations and work ethic of the Iranian population should be re-examined. The internet blackouts mostly harm minorities, and it's deliberate. Iran's history of internet shutdowns is strategic and plentiful. In 2017, Iran shut down the internet after protests erupted in Tehran and the Iranian flag was burned. 3 people were killed by Iran's security forces. Iran has shut down the internet 8 times from December 2018 to November 2021. In July 2021, Iran imposed internet disruptions in response to water protests, particularly in Ahwaz, which suffers from a man-made environmental disaster due to dams, poor water management, and a mixture of willful negligence and deliberate destruction as a form of pressure on the majority Arab population. The devastation brought deaths of water buffaloes, fish, and various other types of animals, and increased drought in the midst of extreme heat. Since most Ahwazis are facing discrimination in hiring to petrochemical and sugar plants in their area, most rely on agriculture for livelihood. All of these shutdowns were response to protests and demonstrations, but in some cases, for example, in November 2021 in Ahwaz, the internet was cut off, but there had not been any demonstrations at that time. In February 2021, for example, a near total internet shutdown was imposed in Sistan and Baluchistan in response to the angry protests erupted in the southeastern province to denounce government policies. According to human rights testimonies, Iranian authorities have used relentless violence to crush demonstrators, including the use of live bullets against them. In May 2022, the government cut off the internet in the cities of Ahwaz, which is in southwest Iran, for a few days, denying people their right to protest the government's decision to raise the prices and the high inflation. And amidst this, video footage and eyewitness accounts indicate that the Iranian security forces have committed extrajudicial killings on a large scale in a climate of total impunity and absence of accountability, which encourages committing further violations. That happened also in November 2021 2019, where there was a week-long internet shutdown, which was followed by a period of extreme abuse in the Ahvaz region. It affected 80 million people, but the Ahvazis residing in peripheral regions and having even more limited means of communications than everyone else, as well as Kurdish and Baloch majority areas, were impacted the most. The May 2022 internet shutdowns came amidst rising bread prices. Iran is heavily dependent on Russia and Ukraine for the grain export. The war has resulted in food shortage, heavily affecting poor and developing countries, and cost of living protests. Iranian economy has been suffering from inflation for decades due to the ever-increasing cost of subsidizing a corrupt system and dispensing money abroad for military adventures and covert operations. But Iran views mass protests as an airing of grievances necessary for its long-term survival and a cost of doing business. The internet blackouts most affect minorities who reside in peripheral areas and have significantly more limited means of getting together at their disposal. Many parts of the peripheral regions are virtually uninhabitable. The shutdown, once again, followed by an outburst of government violence. The shutdown in Ahvaz was near total, but that is the area most heavily affected by oppressive practices, such as confiscation of agricultural lands, deliberate flooding, and control by Chinese rentiers. End of May, the shutdown was precipitated over additional demonstrations in Ahvaz over the collapse of a tower that killed 36 people due to neglect by the authorities. From the point of view of the regime, these measures are backed by legislation. In February 2022, Iran's Majlis sent a protection bill to the Guardian Council, an appointed body that is perceived as an obstacle to democracy in Iran, the role of which is to vet legislation for approval, paving the way to a total control of the internet by the regime. Iran's willingness to shut down the internet for extended period of times brought up concerns that sooner or later Iran will isolate the country from the world completely, and much like North Korea, will eventually allow access only to select regime apparatchiks. The impact of these events has increased frustration and isolation amidst minorities, pitting them against the Persian mainstream opposition, which refused to differentiate among general issues such as food prices, which precipitated uprisings in the more mixed parts of the country, and Arab grievances that had led to additional specific uprisings in Ahvaz, and at times brought about solidarity protests in other ethnic minority peripheral regions. While the minorities appear to have the most at stake for changing the system to respond to their specific issues, and while collectively they represent between 50 and 70% of the country, with Azeri Turks being the most popular of non-Persians, but also being in part the most integrated ethnic groups outside the forest. Although dissidents, Azerbaijani dissidents like Akbar Naimi, who is lingering in the Evin prisons, also suffer for their cultural identity. These specific issues are being deliberately misrepresented by official and opposition sources and played down by anti-regime politicians and activists in the West. They tend to treat both the internet shutdowns and the events precipitating them as a uniform concern for everyone residing in Iran, which is not the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Rain, for your speech. It's a very, very rich speech and full about all of, good information